Section 31 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in March 2013. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 2, Part 1, The First Voyage Round the World. No one as yet was aware of the immense size of the continent discovered by Christopher Columbus. Still was sought perseveringly on the coast of America, which was thought to be a collection of several islands, the famous strait which should lead at once to the Pacific Ocean and to those Spice Islands, the possession of which would have made the fortune of Spain. While Côte Real and Cabot were seeking for it in the Atlantic Ocean, and Cortés in the furthest part of the Gulf of California, while Pizarro was coasting along Peru and Valdivia was conquering Chile, the solution of this problem was found by a Portuguese in the service of Spain, Ferdinand de Magellan. The son of a gentleman of Cota e Armas, Ferdinand de Magellan was born either at Oporto, at Lisbon, at Villa de Sabrosa, or at Villa de Figueiro. It is not actually known which. The date of his birth is unknown, but it took place towards the end of the 15th century. He had been brought up in the house of King John II, where he received as complete an education as could then be given him. After having made mathematics and navigation his special study, for at this time in Portugal there was an irresistible current which drew the whole country towards maritime expeditions and discoveries, Magellan early embraced a maritime career, and embarked in 1505 with Almeida, who was on his way to the Indies. He took part in the sacking of Quiloa and in all the events of that campaign. The following year he accompanied Vaz Pereira to Sofala. Then, on returning to the Malabar coast, we find him assisting Albuquerque at the taking of Malacca, and bearing himself on that occasion with equal prudence and bravery. He took part in the expedition sent by Albuquerque about 1510 to seek for the famous Spice Islands, under the command of Antonio de Abreu and of Francisco Serrao, which discovered Banda, Amboyna, Ternate, and Tidor. During this time Magellan had landed at the Malaysian Islands, distant 1,800 miles from Malacca, and in the archipelago of the Moluccas he had obtained the circumstantial information which gave birth in his mind to the idea of the voyage which he was destined to accomplish later on. On his return to Portugal, Magellan obtained leave, though not without difficulty, to search through the royal archives. He soon became certain that the Moluccas were situated in the hemisphere which the bull of demarcation adopted at Tordesillas by the kings of Spain and Portugal, and confirmed in 1495 by Pope Alexander VI, had given to Spain. In virtue of this line of demarcation, which was destined to give rise to so many impassioned debates, all the countries situated at 360 miles west of the meridian of the Cape de Verde Islands were to belong to Spain, and all those lying to the east of the same meridian to Portugal. Magellan was of too active a nature to remain long without again taking service. He went next to fight in Africa at Azamor, a town in Morocco, where he received a slight wound in his knee, but one which by injuring a nerve made him lame for the remainder of his life, and obliged him to return to Portugal. Conscious of the superiority which his theoretical and practical knowledge and his services had earned for him above the herd of courtiers, Magellan naturally felt more keenly than another would have done the unjust treatment he received from Emmanuel with regard to certain complaints laid by the people of Azamor against the Portuguese officers. King Emmanuel's prejudices soon changed to a real dislike. It showed itself by the outrageous imputation that Magellan was pretending to suffer from a wound which was really of no consequence, and was completely cured, that he might escape from accusations which he could not refute. Such an assertion was a serious matter for the honour of Magellan, so susceptible and suspicious. He thereupon came to a desperate determination, which corresponded moreover with the greatness of the insult which he had received. That no one might be ignorant of it, he caused it to be legally set forth that he renounced his rights as a Portuguese citizen and changed his nationality, and he then took out letters of naturalization in Spain. This was to proclaim, as solemnly as could possibly be done, that he intended to be looked upon as a subject of the crown of Castile, to which henceforward he would consecrate his services and his whole life. This was a serious determination, as we can see, which no one blamed, and which even the most severe historians, such as Barros and Faria y Souza, have excused. At the same time as Magellan, the licentiate Rey Falero left Lisbon with his brother Francisco and a merchant named Cristovam de Haro. The former was a man deeply versed in cosmographical knowledge, and had equally with Magellan fallen under Emmanuel's displeasure. Falero had entered into a treaty of partnership with Magellan to reach the Moluccas by a new way, but one which was not otherwise specified, and which remained Magellan's secret. As soon as they arrived in Spain 1517, the two partners submitted their project to Charles V, who accepted it in principle, but there remained the always delicate question touching the means for putting it into execution. Happily, Magellan found in Juan de Aranda, the factor of the Chamber of Commerce, an enthusiastic partisan of his theories, and one who promised to exert all his influence to make the enterprise a success. He had an interview accordingly with the High Chancellor, the Cardinal and Bishop of Burgos, Fonseca. He set forth with such skill the great advantage that Spain would derive from the discovery of a route leading to the very centre of the spice production, and the great prejudice which it would cause to the trade of Portugal, that an agreement was signed on the 22nd of March 1518. The Emperor undertook to pay all the expenses of the expedition on condition that the greater part of the profits should belong to him. But Magellan had still many obstacles to surmount before taking to the sea. In the first place, there were the remonstrances of the Portuguese ambassador, Álvaro de Costa, who, seeing that his endeavours were in vain, even tried to compass the assassination of Magellan, so says Faria y Souza. Then he encountered the ill will of the employees of the Casa de Contratación at Seville, who were jealous of a stranger being entrusted with the command of such an important expedition, and envious of the last token of favour which had been accorded to Magellan and Rey Falero, who had been named commanders of the Order of St. James. But Charles V had given his consent by a public act which seemed to be irrevocable. They tried, however, to make the Emperor alter his decision by organizing, on the 22nd of October 1518, a disturbance paid for with Portuguese gold. It broke out on the pretext that Magellan, who had just had one of his ships drawn on shore for repairs and painting, had decorated it with the Portuguese arms. This last attempt failed miserably, and 3 statutes of the 30th of March and 6th and 30th of April fixed the composition of the crews and named the staff, while a final official document dated from Barcelona the 26th of July 1519 confided the sole command of the expedition to Magellan. What had meanwhile been happening to Rey Falero? We cannot exactly say. But this man, who had up to this time been treated on the same footing as Magellan, and who had perhaps first conceived the project, now found himself quite excluded from the command of the expedition, after some dissensions of which the cause is unknown. His health, already shaken, received a last shock from this affront, and poor Rey Falero, who had become almost childish, having returned to Portugal to see his family, was arrested there and only released upon the intercession of Charles V. At last, after having sworn fidelity and homage to the crown of Castile, Magellan received in his turn the oath of his officers and sailors, and left the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda on the morning of the 10th of August, 1519. But before entering on the narrative of this memorable campaign, we must give a few particulars of the man who has left us the most complete account of it, Francesco Antonio Pigafetta, or Jérôme Pigafetta, as he is often called in France. Born at Venice about 1491 of a noble family, Pigafetta formed part of the suite of the ambassador Francesco Chieri-Calco, sent by Leo X to Charles V, who was then at Barcelona. His attention was no doubt aroused by the noise which the preparations for the expedition made at that time in Spain, and he obtained permission to take part in the voyage. This volunteer proved an excellent recruit, for he showed himself in every respect as faithful and intelligent an observer as he was a brave and courageous companion. He was wounded at the Battle of Zebu, fighting beside Magellan, which prevented him from being present at the banquet during which so many of his companions were destined to lose their lives. As to his narrative, with the exception of some exaggerations of detail according to the taste of that time, it is exact, and the greater part of the descriptions which we owe to him have been verified by modern travellers and learned men, especially by M. Alcide d'Orbigny. Upon his return to Sanlúcar on the 6th of September 1522, after having fulfilled the vow which he had made to go barefoot to return, thanks to Nuestra Señora de la Victoria, the Lombard, as they called him on board the Victoria, presented to Charles V, then at Valladolid, a complete journal of the voyage. When he returned to Italy, by means of the original as well as of some supplementary notes, he wrote a longer narrative of the expedition at the request of Pope Clement VII and of Villiers de l'Isle d'Adam, Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. He sent copies of his work to several distinguished personages, and notably to Louisa of Savoy, mother of Francis I. But she, not understanding, so thinks Harris, the very learned author of the Bibliotheca Americana Vestustissima, the kind of patois used by Pigafetta, and which resembles a mixture of Italian, Venetian, and Spanish, employed a certain Jacques-Antoine Fabre to translate it into French. Instead of giving a faithful translation, Fabre made a kind of abridgment of it. Some critics, however, suppose that this narrative must have been written originally in French. They found their opinion upon the existence of 3 French manuscripts of the 16th century, which give very different readings, and of which 2 are deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris. Pigafetta died at Venice about 1534, in a house in the Rue de la Lune, which in 1800 was still to be seen, and which bore the well-known device, "No rose without a thorn." At the same time, not wishing to confine ourselves to Pigafetta's narrative entirely, we have compared and completed it with that of Maximilian Transylvain, secretary to Charles V, of which there is an Italian translation in Ramusio's valuable collection. The fleet of Magellan consisted of the Trinidad, of 120 tons burden, which carried the flag of the commander of the expedition; the Sant' Antonio, also of 120 tons, commanded by Juan de Carthagena, the second in rank, the person joined with Magellan, says the official document; the Concepcion, of 90 tons, commanded by Gaspar de Quesada; the famous Victoria, of 85 tons, commanded by Luis de Mendoza; and lastly the Santiago, of 75 tons, commanded by João Serrao, called by the Spaniards Serrano. 4 of these captains and nearly all the pilots were Portuguese. Barbosa and Gomez on board the Trinidad, Luis Alfonso de Goes and Vasco Gallego on the Victoria, Serrao, João Lopez de Carvalho on the Concepcion, João Rodrigues de Muefrapil on the Sant Antonio, and João Serrao on the Santiago, with 25 sailors, formed a total of 33 Portuguese out of the whole body of 237 individuals whose names have all been handed down to us, and amongst whom are found a considerable number of Frenchmen. Of the officers whose names have been mentioned, it is to be remembered that Duarte Barbosa was brother-in-law to Magellan, and that Estevam Gomez, who, by returning to Seville on the 6th of May 1521, did not participate in the conclusion of this memorable voyage, was afterwards sent by Charles V to seek for the North-West Passage, and in 1521 sailed along the coast of America from Florida to Rhode Island, and perhaps as far as Cape Cod. Nothing could have been better arranged than this expedition, for the equipment of which the whole resources of the nautical science of that epoch had been taxed. At the moment of departure Magellan gave his last orders to his pilots and captains, and the code of signals which were to ensure anonymity in manoeuvres, and prevent a possible separation. On Monday morning, the 10th of August 1519, the fleet weighed anchor, and sailed down the Guadalquivir as far as Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which forms the port of Seville, where the victualling of the ships was completed, and it was the 20th of September before they were really off. 6 days afterwards the fleet anchored at Tenerife in the Canary archipelago, where both wood and water were taken on board. It was on leaving this island that the first symptoms appeared of the misunderstanding between Magellan and Juan de Carthagena, which was to prove so fatal to the expedition. The latter claimed to be informed by the commander-in-chief of the route which he intended to take, a claim which was at once rejected by Magellan, who declared that he was not called upon to give any explanation to his subordinate. After having passed between the Cape de Verde Islands and Africa, the ships reached the shores of Sierra Leone, where contrary winds and dead calms detained the fleet for 20 days. A painful incident now occurred. During a council which was held on board the flagship, a sharp dispute arose, and Juan de Carthagena, who affected to treat the Captain-General with contempt, having answered him with pride and insolence, Magellan felt obliged to arrest him with his own hand, and to have him put in the stocks, an instrument made of 2 pieces of wood placed one upon the other, and pierced with holes, in which were placed the legs of the sailor who was to be punished. The other captains remonstrated loudly with Magellan against a punishment which was too degrading for a superior officer, and Carthagena in consequence was simply put under arrest and guarded by one of the captains. To the calms now succeeded rain, tempests, and heavy squalls, which obliged the vessels to lie to. During these storms the navigators several times witnessed an electric phenomenon of which the cause was not then known, but which they considered an undoubted sign of the protection of heaven, and which even at the present day is known by the name of St. Elmo's fire. Once past the equinoctial line, a passage which does not at the time seem to have been celebrated by the grotesque ceremony of baptism which is in vogue at the present day, they steered for Brazil, where, on the 13th of December 1519, the fleet cast anchor in the magnificent port of Santa Lucia, now known under the name of Rio Janeiro. This was not, however, the first time that this bay had been seen by Europeans, as was long believed. Since the year 1511 it had been known under the name of Bahia de Cabo Frio. It had been visited also, 4 years before Magellan's arrival, by Pero Lopez, and seems to have been frequented since the commencement of the 16th century by mariners from Dieppe, who, inheritors of the passion for adventurous navigation of their ancestors the Northmen, roamed over the world and founded small establishments or factories in all directions. Here the Spanish expedition procured cheaply, in exchange for looking-glasses, pieces of ribbon, scissors, hawks' bells or fish-hooks, a quantity of provisions, amongst which Pigafetta mentions pineapples, sugar canes, sweet potatoes, fowl, and the flesh of the anta, which is thought to be the tapir. The account given in the same narrative of the manners of the inhabitants is sufficiently curious to be repeated. "The Brazilians are not Christians," he says, "but no more are they idolaters, for they worship nothing. Natural instinct is their only law." This is an interesting fact, and a singular avowal for an Italian of the 16th century, deeply imbued with superstition. It offers one more proof that the idea of the divinity is not innate, as some theologians have imagined. These natives live to a great age. They go entirely naked and sleep in cotton nets called hammocks, suspended by the two ends to beams. As to their boats, called canoes, each is hollowed out of a single trunk of a tree, and can hold as many as 40 men. They are anthropophagi, cannibals, but only on special occasions, and scarcely ever eat any but their enemies taken in battle. Their dress of ceremony is a kind of vest made of paroquet's feathers, woven together and so arranged that the large wing and tail feathers form a sort of girdle round their loins, which gives them a whimsical and ridiculous appearance. We have already said that the feather clock was in use on the shores of the Pacific among the Peruvians. It is curious to ascertain that it was worn equally by the Brazilians. Some specimens of this singular garment may be seen at the exhibition of the Ethnographical Museum. This was not, however, the only ornament of these savages. They suspended little stone cylinders from 3 holes pierced in the lower lip, a custom which is common among many of the oceanic people, and which may be compared with our fashion of earrings. These people were extremely credulous and of good disposition, and thus, as Pigafetta says, they could easily have been converted to Christianity, for they assisted in silence and with gravity at the mass which was said on shore, a remark that Alvarez Cabral had already made. After remaining 13 days in this place, the squadron continued its route to the south, coasting along the shore, and arrived at 34 degrees 40 minutes of south latitude in a country where flowed a large river of fresh water. It was the La Plata. The natives, called Charruas, were so frightened at the sight of the vessels that they hastily took refuge in the interior of the country, carrying with them all their valuables, and it was impossible to overtake any of them. It was in this country that 4 years previously Juan Diaz de Solis had been massacred by a tribe of Charruas, armed with that terrible engine which is still in use at the present day among the gauchos of the Argentine Republic, the bolas, which are metal balls fastened to the two ends of a long leather thong, called a lasso. A little below the estuary of the La Plata, once thought to be an arm of the sea opening into the Pacific, the flotilla anchored at Port Desire. Here they obtained an ample supply of penguins for the crews of the 5 vessels, a bird which did not make a very delicious meal. Then they anchored in 49 degrees 30 minutes in a beautiful harbour, where Magellan resolved to winter, and which received the name of St. Julian's Bay. The Spaniards had been 2 months there, when one day they perceived a man who seemed to them to be of gigantic stature. At the sight of them he began dancing and singing and throwing dust upon his head. This was a Patagonian who allowed himself without resistance to be taken on board the vessels. He showed the greatest surprise at all he saw around him, but nothing astonished him so much as a large steel mirror which was presented to him. The giant, who had not the least idea of the use of this piece of furniture, and who, no doubt, now saw his own face for the first time, drew back in such terror that he threw to the ground 4 of our people who were behind him. He was taken back on shore loaded with presents, and the kind welcome which he had received induced 18 of his companions, 13 women and 5 men, to come on board. They were tall and had broad faces, painted red except the eyes, which were encircled with yellow. Their hair was whitened with lime, they were wrapped in enormous fur cloaks, and wore those large leather boots from which was given to them the name of large feet, or Patagonians. Their stature was not, however, so gigantic as it appeared to our simple narrator, for it varies from 5 feet 10 inches to 5 feet 8 inches, being somewhat above the middle height among Europeans. For arms they had a short massive bow and arrows made of reed, of which the point was formed of a sharp pebble. The captain, to retain 2 of these savages whom he wished to take to Europe, used a stratagem which we should characterize as hateful in the present day, but which had nothing revolting about it for the 16th century, when Indians and Negroes were universally considered to be a kind of brute beasts. Magellan loaded these Indians with presents, and when he saw them embarrassed with the quantity, he offered to each of them one of those iron rings used for chaining captives. They would have desired to carry them away, for they valued iron above everything, but their hands were full. It was then proposed to fasten the rings to their legs, to which they agreed without suspicion. The sailors then closed the rings so that the savages found themselves in fetters. Nothing can give an idea of their fury when they discovered this stratagem, worthy rather of savages than of civilized men. The capture of others was attempted, but in vain, and in the chase one of the Spaniards was wounded by a poisoned arrow, which caused his death almost instantaneously. Intrepid hunters, these people wander about perpetually in pursuit of guanakis and other game. They are endowed with such wonderful voracity that what would suffice for the nourishment of 20 sailors can scarcely satisfy 7 or 8 of them. Magellan, foreseeing that the stay here was likely to be prolonged, and perceiving that the country only presented meagre resources, gave orders to economize the provisions, and to put the men on fixed rations, that they might not experience too great privations before the spring, when they might reach a country where there was more game. But the Spaniards, discontented at the sterility of the place, and at the length and rigour of the winter, began to murmur. This land seemed to stretch southward as far as the Antarctic Pole, they said. There did not seem to be any strait. Already several had died from the privations they had endured. Lastly, it was time to return to Spain, if the commander did not wish to see all his men perish in this place. End of second part, Chapter 2, Part 1. Section 32 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in April 2012. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 2, Part 2. Magellan, fully resolved to die, or else to bring the enterprise he commanded to a successful issue, replied that the Emperor had assigned him the course which the voyage was to take, and he neither could nor would depart from it under any pretext, and that in consequence he should go straight forward to the end of this land, or until he met with some strait. As to provisions, if they found them insufficient, his men might add to their rations the produce of their fishing or hunting. Magellan thought that so firm a declaration would impose silence on the malcontents, and that he would hear no more of privations, from which he suffered equally with his crews. He deceived himself completely. Certain of the captains, and Juan de Cartagena in particular, were interested in causing a revolt to break out. These rebels, therefore, began by reminding the Spaniards of their old animosity against the Portuguese. The Captain General, being one of the latter nation, had never, according to them, tendered a wholehearted allegiance to the Spanish flag. In order to be able to return to his own country and to gain pardon for what he had done wrong, he wished to commit some heinous crime, and nothing could be more advantageous to Portugal than the destruction of this fine fleet. Instead of leading them to the archipelago of the Moluccas, of the riches of which he had boasted to them, he wished to take them into frozen regions, the dwelling place of eternal snow, where he could easily manage that they should all perish. Then, with the help of the Portuguese on board the squadron, he would take back to his own country the vessels which he had seized. Such were the reports and accusations that the partisans of Juan de Cartagena, Luis de Mendoza, and Gaspar de Quesada had disseminated among the sailors, when on Palm Sunday, the 1st of April 1520, Magellan summoned the captains, officers, and pilots to hear mass on board his vessel and to dine with him afterwards. Alvaro de la Mezquita, a cousin of the Captain General, accepted this invitation with Antonio de Coca and his officers, but neither Mendoza nor Quesada nor Juan de Cartagena, who was Quesada's prisoner, appeared. The next night the malcontents boarded the Sant' Antonio with 30 of the men of the Concepcion and desired to have La Mezquita given up to them. The pilot, Juan de Elioraga, while defending his captain, received 4 stabs from a poniard in the arm. Quesada cried out at the same time, "You will see that this fool will make our business fail." The 3 vessels, the Concepcion, Sant' Antonio, and Santiago, fell without difficulty into the hands of the rebels, who reckoned more than one accomplice among the crews. In spite of this success, the 3 captains did not dare openly to attack the commander-in-chief, and sent to them some proposals for a reconciliation. Magellan ordered them to come on board the Trinidad to confer with him, but this they stoutly refused to do, whereupon Magellan, having no further need of caution, had the boat seized which had brought him this answer, and choosing 6 strong and brave men from amongst his crew, he sent them on board the Victoria under the command of the alguazil Espinosa. He carried a letter from Magellan to Mendoza enjoining him to come on board the Trinidad, and when Mendoza smiled in a scornful manner, Espinosa stabbed him in the throat with a poniard, while the sailor struck him on the head with a cutlass. While these events were taking place, another boat, laden with 15 armed men, came alongside the Victoria, and took possession of her without any resistance from the sailors, surprised by the rapidity of the action. On the next day, the 3rd of April, the 2 other rebel vessels were taken, not, however, without bloodshed. Mendoza's body was divided into quarters, while a clerk read in a loud voice the sentence that blasted his memory. 3 days afterwards, Quesada was beheaded and cut in pieces by his own servant, who undertook this sad task to save his own life. As to Cartagena, the high rank which the royal edict had conferred upon him in the expedition saved him from death, but with Gomez de la Arena, the chaplain, he was left behind on the shore, where some months afterwards he was found by Estevam Gomez. 40 sailors convicted of rebellion were pardoned because their services were considered indispensable. After this severe lesson, Magellan might well hope that the mutinous spirit was really subdued. When the temperature became milder, the anchors were weighed, the squadron put to sea on the 24th of August, following the coast and carefully exploring all the gulfs to find that strait which had been so persistently sought. At the level of Cape St. Croix, one of the vessels, the Santiago, was lost on the rocks during a violent gale from the east. Happily, both the men and merchandise on board were saved, and they succeeded also in taking from the wrecked vessel the rigging and appurtenances of the ship, which they divided among the 4 remaining vessels. At last, on the 21st of October, according to Pigafetta, the 27th of November, according to Maximilian Transylvan, the flotilla penetrated by a narrow entrance into a gulf, at the bottom of which a strait opened, which as they soon saw passed into the sea to the south. First they called this the Strait of the 11,000 Virgins, because this was the day dedicated to them. On each side of the strait rose high land covered with snow, on which they saw numerous fires, especially to the left, but they were unable to obtain any communication with the natives. The details which Pigafetta and Martin Transylvain have given with regard to the topological and hydrographical dispositions of this strait are rather vague, and as we shall have to mention it again when we speak of the Bougainville's expedition, we shall not dilate upon it now. After sailing for 22 days across this succession of narrow inlets and arms of the sea, in some places 3 miles wide, in some 12, which extends for a distance of 440 miles and has received the name of Magellan's Strait, the flotilla emerged upon a sea of immense extent and great depth. The rejoicings were general when at last the sailors found themselves at the long-wished-for end of their efforts. Henceforward the route was open and Magellan's clever conjectures were realized. Nothing is more extraordinary than the navigation of Magellan upon this ocean, which he called Pacific because for 4 months no storm assailed him upon it. The privations endured by the crews during this long space of time were excessive. The biscuit was nothing more than dust mixed with worms, while the water had become bad and gave out an unbearable smell. The sailors were obliged to eat mice and sawdust to prevent themselves from dying of hunger, and to gnaw all the leather that it was possible to find. As it was easy to foresee under these circumstances, the crews were decimated by scurvy. 19 men died, and 30 were seized with violent pains in their arms and legs, which caused prolonged sufferings. At last, after having sailed over more than 12,000 miles without meeting with a single island, in a sea where so many and such populous archipelagos were destined to be discovered, the fleet came upon 2 desert and sterile islands, called for that reason the Unfortunate Islands, but of which the position is indicated in much too contradictory a manner for it to be possible to recognize them. In 12 degrees north latitude and 146 degrees longitude, on Wednesday the 6th of March, the navigators discovered successively 3 islands, at which they greatly desired to stop to recruit and take in fresh provisions, but the islanders who came on board stole so many things without the possibility of preventing them, that the sailors were obliged to give up the idea of remaining there. The natives contrived even to carry off a long boat. Magellan, indignant at such daring, made a descent with 40 armed men, burned some houses and boats, and killed 7 men. These islanders had neither chief, king, nor religion. Their heads were covered with palm leaf hats, they wore beards, and their hair descended to their waists. Generally of an olive tint, they thought they embellished themselves by colouring their teeth black and red, while their bodies were anointed with coconut oil, no doubt in order to protect themselves from the heat of the sun. Their canoes of curious construction carried a very large matting sail, which might have easily capsized the boat if the precaution had not been taken of giving a more stable trim by means of a long piece of wood kept at a certain distance by 2 poles. This is what is called the balance. These islanders were very industrious, but had a singular aptitude for stealing, which has gained for their country the name of the Islands of Thieves, Ladrone Islands. On the 16th of March was seen, at about 900 miles from the Ladrones, some high ground. This was soon discovered to be an island which now goes by the name of Samar Island. There Magellan, resolving to give his exhausted crews some rest, caused 2 tents to be pitched on land for the use of the sick. The natives quickly brought bananas, palm wine, coconuts, and fish, for which mirrors, combs, bells, and other similar trifles were offered in exchange. The coconut, a tree which is valuable beyond all others, supplied these natives with their bread, wine, oil, and vinegar, and besides they obtained from it their clothing and the necessary wood for building and roofing in their huts. The natives soon became familiar with the Spaniards, and told them that their archipelago produced cloves, cinnamon, pepper, nutmegs, ginger, maize or Indian corn, and that even gold was found there. Magellan gave this archipelago the name of the St. Lazarus Islands, afterwards changed to that of the Philippines from the name of Philip of Austria, son of Charles V. This archipelago is formed of a great number of islands which extend in Malaysia, between 5 degrees 32 minutes and 19 degrees 38 minutes north latitude, and 114 degrees 56 minutes and 123 degrees 43 minutes longitude east of the meridian of Paris. The most important are Luzon, Mindoro, Leyte, the Ceylon of Pigafetta, Samar, Panay, Negros, Cebu, Bohol, Palawan, and Mindanao. When they were a little restored, the Spaniards put to sea again, in order to explore the archipelago. They saw in succession the islands of Senalo, Huinaugan, Ibuson, and Abarien, as well as another island called Masava, of which the King Colambu could make himself understood by a slave, a native of Sumatra, whom Magellan had taken to Europe from India, and who, by his knowledge of Malay, rendered signal service in several instances. The king came on board with 6 or 8 of his principal subjects. He brought with him presents for the Captain General, and in exchange he received a vest of red and yellow cloth, made in Turkish fashion, and a cap of fine scarlet, while mirrors and knives were given to the members of his suite. The Spaniards showed him all their firearms, and fired some shots from the cannon in his presence, at which he was much terrified. Then Magellan caused one of our number to be fully armed, says Pigafetta, and ordered 3 men to give him blows with the sword and stiletto, to show the king that nothing could wound a man armed in this manner, which surprised him greatly, and turning to the interpreter, he said to the captain through him, that a man thus armed could fight against 100. Yes, replied the interpreter in the name of the commandant, and each of the 3 vessels carries 200 men armed in this manner. The king, astonished by all that he had seen, took leave of the captain, begging him to send 2 of his men with him to let him see something of the island. Pigafetta was chosen, and was much satisfied with the welcome that he received. The king told him that in this island they found pieces of gold as large as nuts, and even eggs, mixed with the earth which they passed through a sieve to find them. All his vessels, and even some of the ornaments of his house, were of this metal. He was very neatly dressed, according to the custom of the country, and was the finest man that I have seen among these people. His black hair fell upon his shoulders, a silk veil covered his head, and he wore 2 rings in his ears. From his waist to his knees he was covered with a cotton cloth embroidered in silk. On each of his teeth there were 3 spots of gold, arranged in such a manner that one would have said all his teeth were fastened together with this metal. He was perfumed with storax and benzoin. His skin was painted, but his natural tint was olive. On Easter Day, the Europeans went on shore to celebrate Mass in a kind of little church which they had constructed on the seashore with sails and branches of trees. An altar had been set up, and during the whole time that the religious ceremony lasted, the king, with a large concourse of people, listened in silence and imitated all the motions of the Spaniards. Then, a cross having been planted on a hill with great solemnity, they weighed anchor and made for the port of Zebu, as being the best for revictualling the vessels and trading. They arrived there on Sunday, the 7th of April. Magellan sent one of his officers on shore at once with the interpreter, as ambassador to the king of Zebu. The envoy explained that the chief of the squadron was under the orders of the greatest king in the world. The object of the voyage, he added, was the wish to pay him a visit, and at the same time to take in some fresh provisions in exchange for merchandise, and then go to the Molucca Islands. Such were the motives which caused them to tarry in a country where they came as friends. "They are welcome," replied the king, "but if they intend to trade, they should pay a duty to which all vessels are subject that enter my port, as did, not 4 days since, a junk from Siam, which came to seek for slaves and gold, to which a Moorish merchant who has remained in this country can testify." The Spaniard replied that his master was too great a king to submit to such an unreasonable demand. They had come with pacific intentions, but if war were declared, it would be seen with whom they had to deal. The King of Zebu, warned by the Moorish merchant of the power of those who stood before him, and whom he took for Portuguese, at length consented to forego his claims. Moreover, the King of Massava, who had continued to serve as pilot to the Spaniards, so altered the inclinations of his brother sovereign that the Spaniards obtained the exclusive privilege of trading in the island, and a loyal friendship was sealed between the King of Zebu and Magellan by an exchange of blood which each drew from his right arm. From this moment provisions were brought and cordial relations established. The nephew of the king came with a numerous suite to visit Magellan on board his ship, and the latter took this opportunity to relate to his visitors the wonderful history of the creation of the world, and of the redemption of the human race, and to invite him and his people to become converts to Christianity. They showed no repugnance to being baptized, and on the 14th of April the kings of Zebu and Massava, and the Moorish merchant, with 500 men and as many women, received baptism. But what was only a fashion at first, for it cannot be said that the natives knew the religion which they embraced or were persuaded of its truth, became a real frenzy after a wonderful cure had been effected by Magellan. Having learned that the father of the king had been ill for 2 years and was on the point of death, the Captain General promised that if he consented to be baptized and the natives would burn their idols, he would find himself cured. He added that he was so convinced of what he said, relates Pigafetta, for it is as well to quote the author verbatim in such a matter, that he agreed to lose his head if what he promised did not happen immediately. We then made a procession with all possible pomp from the place where we were to the sick man's house, whom we found really in a very sad state, that he could neither speak nor move. We baptized him with 2 of his wives and 10 daughters. The captain asked him directly after his baptism how he found himself, and he suddenly replied that thanks to our Lord he was well. We were all witnesses of this miracle. The captain above all rendered thanks to God for it. He gave the prince a refreshing drink, and continued to send him some of it every day till he was quite restored. On the 5th day the invalid found himself quite cured and got up. His first care was to have burned, in the presence of the king and all the people, an idol for which he had great veneration, and which some old women guarded carefully in his house. He also caused some temples which stood on the seashore, and in which the people assembled to eat the meat consecrated to their old divinities, to be thrown down. All the inhabitants applauded these acts, and proposed themselves to go and destroy all the idols, even those which were in use in the king's house, crying at the same time, "Vive la Castile!" in honor of the King of Spain. Near to the island of Zebu is another island called Matan, which had 2 chiefs, one of whom had recognized the authority of Spain, while the other having energetically resisted it. Magellan resolved to impose it upon him by force. On Friday, the 26th of April, 3 longboats left for the island of Matan, containing 60 men wearing cuirasses and helmets, and armed with muskets, and 30 balangais bearing the King of Zebu, his son-in-law, and a number of warriors. The Spaniards waited for day, and then to the number of 49 leapt into the water, for the boats could not approach the land on account of the rocks and shallow water. More than 1,500 natives awaited them, and at once threw themselves upon them and attacked them in 3 troops, both in front and flank. The musketeers and the crossbow men fired on the multitude of warriors from a distance, without doing them much harm, they being protected by their bucklers. The Spaniards, assailed by stones, arrows, javelins, and lances, and overwhelmed by numbers, set fire to some huts to disperse and intimidate the natives. But these, made more furious by the sight of the fire, redoubled their efforts, and pressed the Spaniards on all sides, who had the greatest difficulty in resisting them, when a sad event took place which compromised the issue of the combat. The natives were not slow in remarking that all the blows which they had directed towards those parts of their enemies' bodies which were protected by armour caused no wounds. They set themselves therefore to hurl their arrows and javelins against the lower part of the body, which was undefended. Magellan, wounded in the leg by a poisoned arrow, gave the order for retreat, which, begun in good order, soon changed into such a flight that 7 or 8 Spaniards alone remained at his side. With much difficulty they kept moving backwards, fighting as they went, in order to reach the boats. They were already knee-deep in the water when several islanders rushed all together upon Magellan, who, wounded in the arm, was unable to draw his sword. They gave him such a sabre cut upon his leg that he immediately fell down in the water, where he was speedily dispatched. His remaining companions, and among them Pigafetta, every one of whom had been hit, hastily regained the boats. Thus perished the illustrious Magellan on the 27th of April, 1521. He was adorned with every virtue, says Pigafetta, and ever exhibited an unshaken constancy in the midst of the greatest adversity. At sea he always condemned himself to greater privations than the rest of his crew. Better versed than any one else in the knowledge of nautical charts, he was perfect at the art of navigation, as he proved by making the tour of the world, which none before him had ventured to do. Pigafetta's funeral eulogy, though a little hyperbolical, is not untrue in the main. Magellan had need of singular constancy and perseverance to penetrate, despite the fears of his companions, into regions peopled by the superstitious spirit of the time with fantastic dangers. Peculiar nautical science was also necessary to achieve the discovery at the extremity of that long coast of the strait which so justly bears his name. He was obliged to give unceasing attention to avoid all untoward accidents while exploring those unknown parts without any exact instruments. That one of the vessels was lost must be imputed to pride and a spirit of revolt in her own captain, more than to any incapacity or want of caution in the captain general. Let us add with our enthusiastic narrator, "The glory of Magellan will survive his death." End of second part, chapter 2, part 2. Section 33 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avaí in April 2012. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, chapter 2, part 3. Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's brother-in-law, and Juan Serrano were elected commanders by the Spaniards, who were destined to meet with further catastrophes. The slave who had acted as interpreter up to this time had been slightly wounded during the battle. From the time of his master's death he had kept aloof, not rendering any further service to the Spaniards, and remaining extended upon his mat. After some rather sharp reproofs from Barbosa, who told him that his master's death did not make him a free man, he disappeared all at once. He was gone to the newly baptized king, to whom he declared that if he could allure the Spaniards into some trap and then kill them, he would make himself master of all their provisions and merchandise. Serrano, Barbosa, and 27 Spaniards were accordingly invited to a solemn assembly to receive the presents destined by the king of Zebu for the emperor. During the banquet they were attacked unexpectedly, and were all massacred except Serrano, who was led bound to the seashore, where he besought his companions to ransom him, for if they did not, he would be murdered. But Juan de Carvalho and the others, fearing that the insurrection would become general, and that they might be attacked during the negotiations by a numerous fleet which they would not be able to resist, turned a deaf ear to the unfortunate Serrano's supplications. The ship set sail and reached the island of Bohol, which was not far distant. When there, thinking that their numbers were too much reduced to navigate 3 vessels, they burned the Concepcion, after having transshipped all that was most precious on board the other vessels. Then, after having coasted along the island of Panilongon, they stopped at Butuan, which forms part of Mindanao, a magnificent island, with numerous ports, and rivers abounding in fish, to the northwest of which lies the island of Luzon, the most considerable of the archipelago. The ships touched also at Paloan, where they found pigs, goats, fowls, different kinds of bananas, coconuts, sugar canes, and rice, with which they provisioned the ships. This was for them, as Pigafetta expresses it, a promised land. Among the things which he thought worthy of notice, the Italian traveller mentions the cocks kept by the natives for fighting, a passion which after so many years is still deeply rooted amongst the population of the whole Philippine archipelago. From Paloan the Spaniards next went to the island of Borneo, the centre of Malay civilization. From that time they had no longer to deal with poverty-stricken people, but with a rich population who received them with magnificence. Their reception by the Rajah is sufficiently curious to warrant a few words being devoted to it. At the landing place they found 2 elephants with silk trappings, who bore the strangers to the house of the governor of the town, while 12 men carried the presents which were to be offered to the Rajah. From the governor's house where they slept to the palace of the king, the streets were kept by armed men. Upon descending from their elephants, the Spaniards were admitted to a room filled with courtiers. At the end of this room opened another smaller room, hung with cloth of gold, in which were 300 men of the king's guard, armed with poniards. Through a door they could then see the Rajah, sitting by a table with a little child, chewing betel nut. Behind him there were only some women. Etiquette required that the petition to be made must pass in succession through the mouths of 3 nobles, each of higher rank than the last, before being transmitted, by means of a hollow cane placed in a hole in the wall, to one of the principal officers, who submitted it to the king. Then there was an exchange of presents, after which the Spanish ambassadors were conducted back to their vessels with the same ceremony as on their arrival. The capital is built on piles in the sea, so that when the tide rises, the women who sell provisions go about the town in boats. On the 29th of July more than 100 canoes surrounded the 2 vessels, whilst at the same time some junks weighed anchor to approach them more nearly. The Spaniards, fearing to be treacherously attacked, took the initiative and fired off their artillery, which killed a number of people in the canoes, upon which the king excused himself, saying that his fleet had not been directed against them, but against the Gentiles with whom the Mussulmen had daily combats. This island produces arrack, the alcohol of rice, camphor, cinnamon, ginger, oranges, citrons, sugar canes, melons, radishes, onions, etc. The articles of exchange are copper, quicksilver, cinnabar, glass, woolen cloths and canvas, and above all iron and spectacles, without mentioning porcelain, and diamonds, some of which were of extraordinary size and value. The fauna comprises elephants, horses, buffaloes, pigs, goats, and domestic poultry. The money in use is of bronze, it is called sapek, and consists of small coins which are perforated with holes, that they may be strung together. On leaving Borneo, the travellers sought for a suitable spot in which to repair their vessels, which were in such great need of it that the men were not less than 42 days over the work. "The oddest things which I have found in this island," says Pigafetta, "are the trees of which all the leaves are animated. These leaves resemble those of the mulberry, but are not so long, the stalk is short and pointed, and near the stalk on both sides there are 2 feet. If you touch the leaves they escape, but when crushed no blood comes from them. I have kept one of them in a box for 9 years. When I opened the box, a leaf was walking about in it. I believe they must live upon air." These very curious animals are well known at the present day, and are commonly called leaf flies (mouche-feuille). They are of a grey-brown, which makes them more easily mistaken for dead leaves, which they exactly resemble in appearance. It was while in these parts that the Spanish expedition, which during Magellan's life had preserved its scientific character, began perceptibly to become piratical. Thus, on several occasions, junks were seized upon, and their crews forced by their Spanish captors to pay large ransoms. The ships next passed by the archipelago of the Sulu Islands, the haunt of Malay pirates, who have even now only largely submitted to the Spanish arms; then by Mindanao, which had been already visited, for it was known that the eagerly sought-for Moluccas must be in its neighbourhood, whether more or less remote. At last, after having seen a number of islands, of which the names would not convey much idea to us, on Wednesday, the 6th of November, the Spaniards discovered the archipelago, about which the Portuguese had related such terrifying fables, and 2 days later they landed at Tidor. Thus the object of the voyage was attained. The king came to meet the Spaniards, and invited them to go on board his canoe. He was seated under a silk parasol which covered him entirely. In front of him were placed one of his sons who carried the royal sceptre, 2 men who had each a golden vase full of water for washing the king's hands, and 2 others holding small gilt boxes filled with betel. Then the Spaniards made the king come on board the vessels, where they showed him much respect, at the same time loading him and those who accompanied him with presents, which seemed to them very precious. "This king is a Moor, that is to say, an Arab," Pigafetta affirms. "He is nearly 45 years of age, tolerably well made, and with a fine physiognomy. His clothing consisted of a very fine shirt, the cuffs of which were embroidered in gold, drapery descended from his waist to his feet, a silk veil, no doubt a turban, covered his head, and upon this veil there was a garland of flowers. His name is Raja Sultan Manzor." The next day, in a long interview which he had with the Spaniards, Manzor declared his intention of placing himself with the islands of Ternate and Tidor under the protection of the King of Spain. This is the place to give some details about the archipelago of the Moluccas, drawn from Pigafetta's narrative, which we are following step by step in the version that M.Ed. Charton has given, and to which he has added such valuable notes. This archipelago, properly speaking, comprises the islands of Gilolo, Ternate, Tidor, Mornay, Batchian, and Misal, but the Banda and Amboyna groups are also often comprehended under the general name of Molucca. Formerly convulsed by repeated volcanic commotions, this archipelago contains a great number of craters almost all extinct, or in repose during a long succession of years. The air there is burning, and would be almost unfit to breathe, if frequent rains did not fall and refresh the atmosphere. The natural productions are extremely valuable. In the first rank must be placed the sago tree, of which the pith called sago takes, with yams, the place of cereals throughout Malacca. As soon as the tree is cut down, the pith is extracted, which is then grated, passed through a sieve, and afterwards cut up in the form of small rolls, which are dried in the shade. There are also the mulberry, the clove, the nutmeg, the camphor and pepper trees, in fact all the spice trees and all the tropical fruits. The forests contain some valuable kinds of wood, ebony, ironwood, teak, famous for its strength and employed from the most ancient times in costly buildings, and the Calilaban laurel, which yields an aromatic essential oil that is highly prized. At this period domestic animals were not numerous in the Moluccas, but among the wild animals the most curious were the barbirusa, an enormous wild boar with long tusks bent backwards, the opossum, a kind of didelphis a little larger than our squirrel, the phalanger, a marsupial which lives in thick dark forests where it feeds upon leaves and fruit, and the tarsier, a kind of jerboa, a very harmless, inoffensive little animal, with reddish-coloured hair, about the size of a rat, but whose body bears some resemblance to that of an ape. Among the birds, the most remarkable were the paroquets and cockatoos, the birds of paradise of which so many fabulous accounts were given, and which until then had been believed to be without legs, the kingfishers, and the cassowaries, great wading birds almost as large as ostriches. A Portuguese named Lorosa had been long settled in the Moluccas, and to him the Spaniards forwarded a letter in the hope that he would betray his country and attach himself to Spain. They obtained the most curious information from him with regard to the expeditions which the King of Portugal has dispatched to the Cape of Good Hope, to the Rio de la Plata, and to the Moluccas, but from various circumstances these latter expeditions had not been able to take place. He himself had been 16 years in this archipelago, the Portuguese had been installed there for 10 years, but upon this fact they preserved the most complete silence. When Lorosa saw the Spaniards making their preparations for departure, he came on board with his wife and his goods to return to Europe. On the 12th of November all the merchandise destined for barter was landed, it being chiefly derived from the 4 junks which had been seized in Borneo. Certainly the Spaniards traded to great advantage, but nevertheless not to so great an extent as they might have done, for they were in haste to return to Spain. Some vessels from Gilolo and Batchian came also to trade with them, and a few days later they received a considerable stock of cloves from the King of Tidor. This king invited them to a great banquet, which he said it was his custom to give when a vessel or junk was loaded with the first cloves. But the Spaniards, remembering what had happened to them in the Philippines, refused the invitation while presenting compliments and excuses to the king. When their cargo was completed, they set sail. Scarcely had the Trinidad put to sea before it was perceived that she had a serious leak, and the return to Tidor, as fast as possible, was unavoidable. The skilful divers whom the king placed at the disposal of the Spaniards were unable to discover the hole, and it became necessary to partly unload the ship to make the necessary repairs. The sailors who were on board the Victoria would not wait for their companions, and the ship's officers, seeing clearly that the Trinidad would not be fit for the voyage to Spain, decided that she should go to Darien, where her valuable cargo would be discharged and transported across the isthmus to the Atlantic, where a vessel would be sent to fetch it. But neither the unfortunate vessel nor her crew was destined ever to return to Spain. The Trinidad, commanded by the alguazil Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, who had Juan de Carvalho as pilot, was in so bad a state that after leaving Tidor she was obliged to anchor at Ternate, in the port of Talangomi, where her crew consisting of 17 men was immediately imprisoned by the Portuguese. The only reply given to Espinosa's remonstrances was a threat to hang him to the yard of a vessel, and the unfortunate alguazil, after having been transferred to Cochin, was sent to Lisbon, where for 7 months he remained shut up in the prison of the Limoeiro with 2 Spaniards, the sole survivors of the crew of the Trinidad. As to the Victoria, she left Tidor richly laden under the command of Juan Sebastian del Cano, who, after having been simply a pilot on board of one of Magellan's ships, had taken the command of the Concepcion on the 27th of April 1521, and who succeeded to Juan Lopez de Carvalho when the latter was superseded in his command for incapacity. The crew of the Victoria was composed of only 53 Europeans and 13 Indians. 54 Europeans remained at Tidor on board the Trinidad. After passing amidst the islands of Cayoan, Laigoma, Siko, Gyofi, Kafi, Labuan, Toliman, Bachian, Mata, and Batu, the Victoria left this latter island to the west, and, steering west-southwest, stopped during the night at the islands of Zulla or Zala. At 30 miles from thence, the Spaniards anchored at Buro, the Buero of Bougainville, where the ship was revictualled. They stopped 105 miles further on, at Banda, where mace and nutmegs are found, then at Solor, where a great trade in white sandalwood is carried on. They spent a fortnight there to repair their ship, which had suffered much, and there they laid in an ample provision of wax and pepper. Then they anchored at Timor, where they could only obtain provisions by retaining by stratagem the chief of the village and his son, who had come on board the ship. This island was frequented by junks from Luzon, and by the praos from Malacca and Java, which traded largely there in sandalwood and pepper. A little further on the Spaniards touched at Java, where, as it appears, sati was practised at that time, as it has been in India until quite recently. Among the stories which Pigafetta relates, without entirely believing them, is one which is most curious. It concerns a gigantic bird, the Epiornis, of which the bones and the enormous eggs were discovered in Madagascar about the year 1850. It is an instance proving the caution needed before rejecting as fictitious many apparently fabulous legends, but which on examination may prove to possess a substratum of truth. To the north of Greater Java, says Pigafetta, in the Gulf of China, there is a very large tree called Kampangangi, inhabited by certain birds called Garulla, which are so large and strong that they can bear away a buffalo and even an elephant, and carry it as they fly to the place where the tree Pusater is. This legend has been current ever since the 9th century among the Persians and Arabs, and this bird plays a wonderful part in Arabian tales under the name of the Roc. It is not surprising, therefore, that Pigafetta found an analogous tradition among the Malays. After leaving Greater Java, the Victoria rounded the peninsula of Malacca, which had been subjugated to Portugal by the great Albuquerque 10 years before. In the immediate neighbourhood are Siam and Cambodia, and Chiampa, where rhubarb grows. This substance is discovered in the following manner. A company of from 20 to 25 men go into the wood, where they pass the night in the trees to protect themselves from lions. Note here that there are no lions in this country, and other ferocious beasts, and also that they may better perceive the odour of the rhubarb which the wind wafts towards them. In the morning they go towards the place whence came the odour, and search there for the rhubarb until they find it. Rhubarb is the putrefied wood of a great tree, and acquires its odour even from its putrefaction. The best part of the tree is its root, nevertheless the trunk, which they call kalama, has the same medicinal virtue. Decidedly it is not from Pigafetta that we should seek to acquire botanical knowledge. We should run a great risk of deceiving ourselves if we took in earnest the nonsense that the Moor told him from whom he drew his information. The Lombard traveller gives us also fantastic details about China with the greatest seriousness, and falls into the grave errors which his contemporary Duarte Barbosa had avoided. It is to the latter we owe the information that the trade in Anfiam, or opium, has existed from this period. When once the Victoria had left the shores of Malacca, Sebastian del Cano took great care to avoid the coast of Zanguebar, where the Portuguese had been established since the beginning of the century. He kept to the open sea as far as 42 degrees south latitude, and for 9 weeks he was obliged to keep the sails furled, on account of the constant west and north-west winds, which ended in a fearful storm. To keep to this course required great perseverance on the part of the captain, with a settled desire on his part to carry his enterprise to a successful issue. The vessel had several leaks, and a number of the sailors demanded an anchorage at Mozambique, for the provisions, which were not salted, having become bad, the crew had only rice and water for food and drink. At last, on the 6th of May, the Cape of Tempests was doubled, and a favourable issue to the voyage might be hoped for. Nevertheless, many vexatious accidents still awaited the navigator. In 2 months, 21 men, Europeans and Indians, died from privations, and if on the 9th of July they had not landed at Santiago, one of the Cape de Verde Islands, the whole crew would have died of hunger. As this archipelago belonged to Portugal, the sailors took care to say that they came from America, and carefully concealed the route which they had discovered. But one of the sailors having had the imprudence to say that the Victoria was the only vessel of Magellan's squadron which had returned to Europe, the Portuguese immediately seized the crew of a longboat and prepared to attack the Spanish vessel. However, Del Cano on board his vessel was watching all the movements of the Portuguese, and suspecting, by the preparations which he saw, that there was an intention of seizing the Victoria, he set sail, leaving 13 men of his crew in the hands of the Portuguese. Maximilian Transylvain assigns a different motive from the one given by Pigafetta for the anchorage at the Cape de Verde Islands. He asserts that the fatigued state of the crew, who were reduced by privations, and who in spite of everything had not ceased to work the pumps, had decided the captain to stop and buy some slaves to aid them in this work. Having no money, the Spaniards would have paid with some of their spices, which would have opened the eyes of the Portuguese. To see if our journals were correctly kept, says Pigafetta, we inquired on shore what day of the week it was. They replied that it was Thursday, which surprised us, because according to our journals it was as yet only Wednesday. We could not be persuaded that we had made the mistake of a day. I was more astonished myself than the others were, because having always been sufficiently well to keep my journal, I had uninterruptedly marked the days of the week and the course of the months. We learnt afterwards that there was no error in our calculation, for having always travelled towards the west, following the course of the sun, and having returned to the same point, we must have gained 24 hours upon those who had remained stationary. One has only need of reflection to be convinced of this fact. Sebastian del Cano rapidly made the coast of Africa, and on the 6th of September entered the bay of Sanlúcar de Barrameda with a crew of 17 men, almost all of whom were ill. 2 days later he anchored before the mole at Seville, after having accomplished a complete circuit of the world. As soon as he arrived, Sebastian del Cano went to Valladolid, where the court was, and received from Charles V the welcome which was merited after so many difficulties had been courageously overcome. The bold mariner received permission to take as his armorial bearings a globe with this motto, Primus circum dedisti me, and he also received a pension of 500 ducats. The rich freight of the Victoria decided the Emperor to send a second fleet to the Moluccas. The supreme command of it was not, however, given to Sebastian del Cano. It was reserved for the commander Garcia de Loaiza, whose only claim to it was his grand name. However, after the death of the chief of the expedition, which happened as soon as the fleet had passed the Strait of Magellan, Del Cano found himself invested with the command, but he did not hold it long, for he died 6 days afterwards. As for the ship Victoria, she was long preserved in the port of Seville, but in spite of all the care that was taken of her, she at length fell to pieces from old age. End of Second Part, Chapter 2, Part 3.